Our presenter today is Dr. Helena Seli, Associate Professor of Clinical Education in the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California. Helena is an expert on educational psychology with a particular focus on motivation and procrastination. In today's session, she'll be talking about effective learning strategies and self-regulated study. So without further ado, I will hand over to Helena.
All right. Thank you so much, Eleanor. Our names are similar too. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for taking time out of your life to be here as we celebrate effectively the release of the 6th edition of this book. So the book has been on the market and been used and useful for learners of different ages for, goodness, over 20 years now. So delighted to be in the 6th edition. So again, the title of the book, as you see on the screen, is Motivation and Learning Strategies for College Success, a focus on self-regulated learning. But I also want to point out that self-regulation is critical not only for college success, it's critical in elementary, middle, high school, as well as in professional settings. So if you are here not in college, if you are here as a professional, as a faculty member, as a teacher, these strategies definitely don't apply only to college students. They apply to all of us. So the purpose of today's webinar is to talk a little bit about the broad purpose of the book, the features of the book, as well as what is new and what we emphasize in the 6th edition. And then finally, some specific strategies that I want to highlight, some specific strategies as well as insights that I want to highlight that have emerged in the latest, the most current research about self-regulation. So let's go to our first slide. So the purpose of the book. Simply put, the purpose of the book is to present, as you can see, self-regulation as a stronger predictor of performance than what we usually see as sort of the intelligence, the inborn ability, et cetera, the gift from our parents, et cetera. There's still a lot of beliefs out there related to, I can only do as well as I have the IQ for. And we know based on decades of research now that is simply not the case. We know that self-regulation, our ability to apply effort, is a stronger predictor of performance, both in, K-12, college, as well as professional performance than that inborn ability. The purpose and another purpose of the book is to identify the specific components of self-regulation that contribute to that high achievement and performance. So self-regulation is a very nebulous term. What do you mean by self-regulation? Managing our behavior, regulating our behavior. So the book presents some specific components of self-regulation that we know contribute to high achievement and performance, again, in any setting. And finally, our book is one of the few books in the field that is really grounded in research and shares that research with the reader. So we've described effective research-based learning and motivation strategies. So in other words, we don't present only the what you should do or what you should consider doing, but the why based on research. And that ranges from research about the brain, experimental research about motivation, and also current research about the impact of technology. The features of the text, the features of the book that we believe, and we have reason to believe based on student feedback, that makes the book effective are that we provide self-reflective exercises and follow-up activities. So you're not only reading the book, but engaging in reflective activities as we prompt them. So you'll read the text, and many of you, hopefully, who have already read the text know that there'll be take a pause and reflect on your own self, whether it is a strongly agree to disagree reflective prompt or some other ways of sort of gaining insight into your own performance, and some follow-up activities. We have student reflection, so students who have used the book over the last several decades, so versions of the book, have provided us with reflections about how some of the features of the book have benefited them. And then we also have provide guidance of how to engage in a full self-regulation study. So for example, if you really want to understand your time management in more depth, or your tendency to procrastinate in more depth, or your ability to prepare for exams, we provide ways to engage in a sort of a study of your own self-regulation. And finally, the key points are always summarized at the end of each chapter. So again, making the book less of a sort of a long text, but really broken up into activities, reinforcements, self-reflection, and at the end of each chapter, a brief sort of summary of the key points as well as strategies. All right, so what's new in the 6th edition? The purpose of the 6th edition is really to present what we know based on very current research. Self-regulation as a field has been around for about 25 years, but we're constantly learning more about the human brain via neuroscience. We're learning much, much more about the impact of technology. So these are some of the things that are featured in the 6th edition. We also focus on the role of metacognition. And we know that the ability of us to be self-reflective learners and practitioners is becoming more and more important as the world constantly changes around us via technology and via other influences. So the ability for us to reflect on ourselves is critical, not only as students, but as professionals in the future. Again, artificial intelligence around the corner. Multiple innovations that we have to adapt on a continuous basis calls for self-reflective practice, self-reflective behavior. We talk in depth about the difference between multitasking and task switching. So we know that technology, social networking is ever present in our life, not only as available for us, but sometimes intrusive because the phone bings, there's a message, there's an update. But we particularly emphasize that us as humans, we're not really capable of multitasking based on the limitations of what we call our cognitive architecture, how our brain is set up for processing information. We're not capable of multitasking unless one of the tasks is automated, such as, reading while we're walking, or unfortunately, texting while we're driving, because driving is an automated task. Therefore, we have capacity available to engage in texting. But if you have two tasks that both require cognitive processing, you're not really engaging in multitasking. What you're really engaging in is quick task switching. And that comes at a very significant cost for both the time that it takes to perform tasks as well as the quality of the output. We focus on the impact of social networking on emotional and mental health, and I'll come back to that a little bit. Needless to say, there's great benefits to social networking, but there's also, as we now know, some significant negative impacts that exist. We talk about the reasons for test anxiety and how to manage test anxiety. We know based on research that particularly college students' anxiety is on a rapid increase. A higher and higher percentage of college students in well-being studies across the campuses in the world report sometimes crippling levels of anxiety. So we pay specific attention to that sort of development in our book. And then the new strategies that we focus on are listed right there. So looking at creating strategic relationships with instructors, we recognize that more and more information is processed from tech-based media, e-textbooks, learning in online programs, learning from pre-recorded videos. We also have a whole new appendix that we have included that gives support in how to create effective research and presentations. So starting with differentiating credible from not credible resources, presenting research with academic integrity, writing a research paper, and then again, some tips for how to prepare for and deliver effective presentations, including some basics for effective group work strategies. All right. So let's go to the next slide and really present for those of you who have read the book, know the 6 components of self-regulation. So I'll just give you a chance to review them on the screen there for easily also communicated via the key questions that they present. So we know that if you want to understand somebody's level of self-regulation, you want to understand their performance in all of these categories. It can be the case that somebody may be highly motivated to engage in an activity, but may not have the correct approach, may not have the most optimal methods of learning, and performance will not be optimized. And the other way around is if you know methods of learning, you have a whole tool, a whole arsenal of how to study for exams, how to self-test, how to effectively process information from textbook, but the task is not valuable for you, as in you lack motivation, your performance will not be optimal in terms of self-regulation. So the book goes through each of these components, presents the latest research about the sort of what do we know works in these categories? What do we know works in managing time and combating procrastination? What do we know about metacognition when it comes to monitoring performance? And also presents effective strategies to engage in increasing success in that particular area. So let's first look at motivation. I'd like to highlight a couple sort of aspects of self-regulation today, and one of the first ones is motivation. So we present this powerful way to sort of understand your motivation as a learner or as a professional. And we present this Covington and Roberts model that has stood the test of time, which we call the quadrupolar model, simply because there's 4 cells in it. And you can see here that students or learners range from in the degree to which it's important for them to be successful. They desire, they seek success, versus the motive to avoid failure. And we know that those two sort of combine to create at least 4, there may be others, but there's key 4 motivational profiles. So as the text presents, the most optimal way to be motivated is to seek success, right? I want to be successful. I can't wait to earn a good grade. I can't wait to earn my promotion when I've deserved it, when I've worked for it. And I'm not really concerned about, but what if? What if I don't get the grade that I feel I should get? What if that promotion doesn't come through? So success-oriented students and individuals are motivated to reach success, but don't sort of ruminate over the possibility of failure. The other profile is the overstrivers. They also want to seek success, but they also are very high in their concern about the what ifs, the constant rumination of what if I get an A minus? What if I get a B plus? Which we know for some students particularly is evidence of failure. It's not an F, it's an A minus. So these are what we call the overstrivers. These are folks who are likely to, lose sleep, over-prepare, seek extra credit, et cetera, et cetera. But really the question is, what drives them? Is it the desire to be successful, or is it really that they don't want to fail, whatever failure means to them? The next profile is the failure avoiders. Really high in not wanting to fail, really don't care if they succeed. So this is I'll take the passing grade. I'll take the C's so long as I can just squeak by and not get the D's and the F's, which eventually will hamper my ability to move forward. These are the folks, as you can guess, who are likely to engage in procrastination. I'll do things last minute. I'll get them done. I don't really want to be successful. I don't really want to, prepare multiple drafts, just as long as I can get by. And we'll revisit this tendency to procrastinate in just another slide. And then finally, we have the profile who we could call not motivated or amotivation, which is they really don't care if they fail and they really don't seek success either. So they've sort of it's a pattern of sort of learned helplessness as a result of probably multiple failures due to societal factors that have communicated low expectations, as well as obviously their own experiences of not doing enough, of not doing well. Again, not only because of their lack of ability, but because of other impacts and messages from the society very often. And a learned helplessness and hopelessness can result from that, creating that profile of a failure acceptor. All right, so let's go back to these failure avoiders here with the next slide. So this relates to the use of time, and particularly the tendency. What we find is it's not that individual students don't know how to use their time. It's very often that they have elaborate plans. They use their latest version iPhones, which this is not, their latest version of iPhones to set up elaborate schedules, goals, etc., and fail to start it, which obviously, as you can guess, we call procrastination. So let's have you even sort of reflect on these, whether you are here as a student or whether you're here as a professional. And I know I've engaged in many of these. So it could be these thoughts as you're sitting in front of a research paper you should be starting, or a manuscript in my case that I have to turn around and send back to the editorial board. I know I'm engaged in these. It's difficult. I don't want to get started right now. Let me do something easier beforehand. Or let me go get that coffee across the street and I'll come back and maybe I'll feel better. I don't feel like doing it right now. And I feel like I should be doing this when I feel optimally, that I can do it. I don't know where to begin. Or let me check my social networking first. Let me just catch up on the news of the day. And then I'll get started. And lo and behold, unless you're very self-regulated, it's 45 minutes by, and now you're looking at videos of cats and puppies, among other millions of people who have probably used it as a way to procrastinate. So some of the strategies of the book, there's others that the book presents, but some of the strategies are definitely to engage in goal setting. That's the first. We as humans are extremely goal motivated. Think about doing sit-ups. None of us would do 50 sit-ups if we didn't have a goal. It would be like, okay, I'm done with my 3 and I'm feeling it, good enough. We are at our best when we embrace goals. Organizations are at their best when they embrace goals. So setting SMART goals, and I'm sure you've heard this acronym: specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time-bound, or whatever the different versions of translating that acronym are, but engaging in goals. Time telling. One of the things that procrastinators tend to do is they don't know how long it takes to get things done. It's only going to take me a minute, so I can start later. Actually engage in a task and time yourself. How long does it really take? So time telling, to be accurate about the amount of time. Using reinforcement for self. So instead of heading across the street to get that caramel latte or whatever, before I start my task, I'm going to flip that. I'll start the task and then I will go and get my caramel latte. Works much better. So the good old carrot and stick behavior strategies, you can use them on yourself to get out of the gate, because the biggest problem with procrastination really is getting started. So the Nike signal, or the Nike motto is just do it. The motto for procrastination could be just get going. Okay? And reinforcement also by giving yourself tech breaks, right? So going back to that last point, I'll get going and I'll give myself, instead of checking Facebook now or Instagram now or Snapchat or whatnot, I'll give myself a tech break in 15 minutes, okay? This is a trick that I use to combat my own tendency to procrastinate. I tell myself, I know this is hard. I don't feel like doing it right now. I will do it only for 5 minutes. And guess what? 20 minutes later, I will find myself still engaged in the task because, again, the most challenging thing with procrastination is just getting started. And then challenging the procrastination beliefs. And one of the ones that you saw probably was, I work really well under pressure. I work best under pressure. So I really don't have to worry. I really don't have to get going now because I work best under pressure. That is an incredible trap. We find that folks who work under pressure are those who are experts and masters at what they do. They've done it multiple times, and I can't help being in LA today, particularly, and being very impacted, obviously, about the very tragic event yesterday. If you can see in the background, I have the Lakers color there on the orchid. We know that somebody like Kobe Bryant performed under pressure, but we also know from people who worked with him behind the scenes. I've worked with some USC basketball coaches who had the privilege of working with the Lakers in their professional career. Kobe Bryant, based on what I'm told, was always the first one to practice. Even on away games, when they arrived to town very late, Kobe Bryant was one of the first ones, even though he was probably the best on the team among some other players at different times of the Lakers' history. But as one of the best players, if not the best, he was also the first to show up to practice. So we know the illusion of working on best under pressure is true when you've done a task multiple times and you're truly a master at it. If you're here as a college student, writing research papers is not something that you probably have attained mastery at because each research paper is different than the other. They're complex, they're long processes. As a professional, if you're here as a professional, writing that report is probably not something you have attained automation over, that you're truly a master at it. So changing that belief is critical. So I'll give you a chance to just read what you have on the screen there. Okay, so changing that belief that you work best under pressure and realize that you have conditioned yourself not work best under pressure, but only work under pressure. That is not a good recipe for success. So procrastination is something that was around hundreds of years ago, 20-something years ago when we first published the book. That is around and doing well today, even in this very office. As I'm broadcasting this, I have to remember to change my self-talk when I try to engage in procrastination. And methods of learning. Those of you who know the book know that the foundation for the learning strategies that we present and recommend, you take a stab at to find whether you want to, adopt a strategy as it is presented in the textbook or revise an existing approach of yours to incorporate some new aspects. You know that those strategies are founded in how the model of information processing sees the human brain in terms of learning and memory. We know, I won't go into depth with this, it's presented in many places, but also carefully explained in the book. We know that we have at least 3 units, so this is the best we can understand right now about how the human mind works in terms of learning and memory. We know that there's 3 units related to learning and memory, and that the critical component is that working memory, which in some circumstances is also referred to as short-term memory, not to be confused with our sensory store, though. So our working memory is sort of the bottleneck. We have lots of information that comes in from the outside. Our senses register it all. It goes into sort of this bottleneck of the working memory where things get cognitively processed, consciously processed, and then it goes back, if done well, it gets transferred, stored, encoded, into our long-term memory, which is an infinite in terms of duration and capacity. So you literally have this sort of bow tie right here. Lots to come in, little bit to process, a little bit of processing capacity going back out into this long-term memory. And we know that if things are not well processed in working memory, they can go into memory loss. And even though you may have the illusion that you're learning, you are not really storing or better yet, encoding into long-term memory. So if I showed this to you for only a couple seconds, which I'm going to do right now, I'll give you a chance to look at it. Okay. And if I asked you, how many things could you point out? The number of things that you remember and could write down would probably range between 5 to 9 things, right? So you may have noticed things that are relevant to you. You know, I have a dog, so I probably would have noticed this. I love history. I probably would have noticed Napoleon, Mona Lisa, art, history, etc. If you're more into sort of sports, dancing, you know, it's whatever caught your attention that is probably mostly of personal significance is what you're likely to remember. But whatever you remembered, it's probably not more than that 5 to 9 or even lower. So the book also presents the latest research. This number was originally propositioned as the limitation of working memory for humans in the 1950s and 60s. We now know that human working memory capacity is probably even lower and closer to about the 4 to 6 individual units of information. And we know that unless you do something with that information, it's gone within 5 to 15 seconds, as if you never saw it. So if if a car dashes by and for whatever reason you need to remember that license plate, which is about 5 to 9 units, right, of individual letters and numbers. And unless you start saying it in your mind or put it to an alphabet song or something, it'll be gone as if you never saw it. So when we think about the limited working memory capacity, think about all the distractions that we have available. The Twitter, the Instagram, some of us using Facebook, probably not the younger folks in this webinar, but some of us using Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, etc., etc. Constant distractions that are likely to try to get our attention as we're studying, as we're writing reports at work, and everywhere. So essentially what these factors do is rob the available units of working memory capacity. And again, it is the case then that not all your 5 to 9 or even less units of working memory capacity are not only dedicated to the task you're supposed to be doing, writing a research paper, preparing for an exam, whatever it is, but you're now dividing attention to those distractions as well. And in the book, we also present some research about some negative aspects related that emerge related to social network in terms of emotional and mental health. We know that engaging in social comparison as you're using Instagram and Facebook is almost sort of unavoidable. And very often what you end up doing is sort of that upward social comparison. Wow, their life looks wonderful. Look at them with that perfect physique in a tropical island, or look at their beautiful family, or look at the new car they received. Because the truth is, we present via social networking the sort of the wonderful moments of our life. A very small percentage of social networking users sort of are vulnerable and share moments when they are not feeling at their best and are willing to broadcast that to the world. So what you're likely to see is images of us on our best. And that creates sort of that undesirable, inconstructive social comparison that can lead to depression, that can lead to at least feeling sad, but long-term influences leading to depression, leading to anxiety about your life, etc. So the book sort of dives into that in the chapter about self-regulating emotions and presents evidence that there's clear evidence based on millions of people surveyed that if they reduce their social networking time, their mental health tends to improve. We also know of a phenomenon called emotional contagion via social networking. So whether you have positive emotions or whether you have negative emotions that are projected through social networking, some sort of emotional contagion at a pretty large scale can happen as well. And the book presents findings about that. Another thing that happens with the working memory capacity is the phenomenon of stereotype threat. Again, not a new phenomenon. Claude Steele and Aronson identified this phenomenon, as you can see, more than 20 years ago, and it is related, again, to our working memory limitations. So stereotype threat essentially is the fear of doing something that would inadvertently confirm a negative stereotype. There are positive stereotypes out there as well, but this is really concerned about negative stereotypes. And chances are, whoever you are here today, there is a negative stereotype about the group with which you identify, whether it is women in math or some other stereotypes. And so you don't have to endorse that stereotype yourself. That is, I don't believe that as a female I'm worse in math than males are. In fact, my training is in statistical analysis and quantitative analysis. But the fact that there's a stereotype out there in society that is rather prevalent impacts my ability to perform. So, for example, on a test about, if somebody said, okay, Helena, we want to do a test of your general mathematical ability. That stereotype does get sort of resurrected in my consciousness. It's like, oh yeah, as a female, I'm not supposed to be doing as well as males in my mathematical ability. So what happens is the stereotype might make me try harder in order to invalidate it. Wait a minute, I really am. There's no reason for me to believe that I'm less than. So let me prove it. But what it does is it results in depleted working memory capacity because I'm trying to suppress those negative thoughts, right? I'm trying to disconfirm a stereotype. And therefore, my 7 to 9 units or 5 to 9 units of working memory capacity are no longer only dedicated to the task at hand. It can create obviously high anxiety and as a result, underperformance, performing poorer than you are actually positioned to do. So we talk about in the book about how to build sort of identity safety and reduce the stereotype threat by embracing a growth mindset, by knowing that stereotypes are usually based on sort of that inborn, certain ethnic groups are not as good in academics. Certain ethnic groups are not good in sports. Certain genders are not good in certain areas. So it does have to do with that ability. So really embracing to a growth mindset based on the work of Carol Dweck, and the book presents the opposite, sort of the growth versus the fixed mindset. Seeing yourself in moments when you are to take a high stakes test. So really reframing your identity, not based on your gender, but I'm here as a college student or I'm here as a professor in my case, right? I'm a professor. Irrespective of whether I'm female or male, I have earned this position. Therefore, I don't need to worry about my mathematical ability. So reframing your identity when you need to. And naturally thinking of a successful, when those thoughts get sort of rise in your head, you can think about a successful role model who is congruent to you. So whether you're thinking about another female that has reached great success in math, or a member of your racial ethnic group who has attained great success. And in fact, filling the demographic inquiries about gender ethnicity at the end of the task. They're very often put into the front of the task, which obviously can bring up a stereotype. Fill them out at the end. So we present these strategies in the textbook. And research about stereotype threat continues. In fact, Claude Steele has published a wonderful book called Whistling Vivaldi, as in Antonio and Vivaldi, the Italian composer, Whistling Vivaldi, about stereotype threat, the prevalence of it, and what to do about it. This is not to say that stereotype threat explains all sort of what we call achievement gaps, coming from opportunity gaps, but there is a role for stereotype threat in understanding the gaps that exist in performance and achievement. And obviously no presentation about the Dembo Seli, or now the Seli and Dembo book, is complete without some examples of specific learning strategies that we present. So we present learning strategies in three categories: rehearsal, which is the sort of the lowest level, just underlining and highlighting text as you go, flashcards, copying material exactly as it is, such as, definitions, reciting definitions exactly as they are. We naturally don't recommend that. Some very simple content is appropriate for rehearsal, but chances are the content that you in this webinar are engaged with in college or in professional life, you need to learn new skills and knowledge, not appropriate for a rehearsal strategy. We present instead strategies of elaboration and strategies of organization. So in elaboration, it's really summarizing, but in your own words. So using appropriate terminology, but not copying or reciting definitions as they are, but summarizing a definition and stating it in your own words. Not only note-taking in class, but turning it into note-making, which is a much more active process and involves activities both prior, during, and post attending a lecture, for example, and answering questions. So really engaging in sort of self-testing rather than just reviewing underlined text as it is, or maybe even using another highlighter, different color, and underlining, highlighting again as you're going into an exam, but using the strategy of now self-testing instead. Much more active, much more meaningful, much higher chances of actually encoding that information into your long-term memory. And then organization, selecting main ideas, creating your own outline, and very powerful, the learning strategy of representations using hierarchies, matrices, Venn diagrams, sequences, etc., etc. And the book presents some specific ways in which to use representation-related strategies. So we refer to rehearsal as rote learning. You're not really making it very meaningful for you as a learner, given your prior knowledge and other contextual factors. And instead, the book presents the learning strategies of organization and elaboration as meaningful learning strategies, again, with the goal of encoding information in long-term memory. So I have come to the end of my sort of pre-scheduled program, and I will now turn it back to Eleanor for any questions that may have come up from the audience.
Hi, Helena. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sure we all got a lot of insights from that. So at the moment, we just have one question. I'd like to tell everyone that if you do have questions that you've thought of, you can type them in the chat box, and I will read them out for Helena to answer. So the first question is, well, more of a statement, but from Clarissa Cunningham, saying that she would like to see the chart again that had the overstriver and failure avoidant boxes.
Here you go. Did you have any specific questions about the sort of the model, the quadripola, the 4-cell model as we see here?
Clarissa just said, no, thank you so much. She just wanted to see it again.
Got it.
Okay. So next question from Joan Con. Great presentation. Too busy with it to even think of a question to send. Loved it. Want the book. I'll go to Amazon. Thank you so much. That's a lovely, lovely feedback.
Thank you so much.
Chrissy has asked, what are other ways of visually mapping, and do you have some examples?
Okay, let me see here. If you give me just a second, I will pull up another PowerPoint and see if I can actually present some examples of okay, so I think what I'll do is I will turn this PowerPoint off and I will present this one instead. So let me just get that going. Okay. I don't know, can you see my the new PowerPoint or not? Eleanor, can you see the new PowerPoint that I'm presenting?
Yep.
Okay, great. Let me
I can see it now.
Okay, so when we're talking, so the four that the book presents are hierarchy, matrix, sequence, and then diagram, okay? And so let's take a look at the advantages of representation specifically. The advantage, one of the key advantages really is that the information that in a textbook is spread out over 7 pages, for example, can now be presented in physical closeness to each other. So your learning is much more efficient, right? You're not going over and over again the 7 pages of highlights, etc. You're presenting everything in physical proximity. Clutter is reduced, right? You don't need all the narration. All the narration, that the author uses to present the information. You can see the core information. Your cognitive load, right? The working memory capacity is now reduced. The load is reduced, and you have essentially more capacity available to process information. And missing details also become very obvious. So if you're organizing information into a matrix and you're finding a lot of required information to fill in the cells from the book, you might also find that the book doesn't present certain information. So, for example, and the big picture is developed, right? So representations really enable you to kind of zoom back and say, aha, this is the big picture here. So let's take a look at, so a hierarchy obviously is starting like the species, right? The dogs, the cats, the plants, anything that you can categorize into the most general category that then gets broken down into multiple subcategories. So very efficient way of understanding the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, etc. Can you imagine that information being presented in a textbook as narration? We'd all be completely lost. An example of a hierarchy is right here, right? You've got animals in these big categories. We know that mammals further sort of get into this category. You've got this category. You've got carnivores in here. Et cetera, right? Placentals are herbivores, omnivores, carnivores are canines, phenol, et cetera. So the key for a hierarchy is the information from, it's all sort of subcategories of the ones above. A matrix is when you have 2 dimensions, one dimension here and the other dimension here for something, and we'll look at an example of it, and then you fill in the details. So for example, this is not an example of it, but let me go back to here. So example, if you can see it in here, it's a little faint, but when you're looking at the information processing system, right, we have 3 units, sensory store, working memory, long-term memory, and we can analyze them all based on the capacity and duration, right? So this is not filled out here. It's obviously a PowerPoint I wasn't really planning on showing. It just occurred to me that I have it handy. You can fill this in here. Working memory capacity is small, 7 plus minus 2, if not less. The duration, as I went over and the book presents, is also very brief, 5 to 15 seconds. While long-term memory, we know, is capacity is indefinite or unlimited, and the duration is indefinitely long. We know that unless something happens to information that you truly learned, such as in cases of dementia, Alzheimer's, when literally the neural networks get broken down, that information is in your long-term memory still. The storage is not sort of exhausted. It's just that you cannot retrieve it because you haven't used it in a long time. It's sort of buried somewhere deep in your neural networks. And similarly, sensory store capacity is this is debated whether it's large or whether it's very tiny, but we know that the duration is minuscule. We record so much through our senses, our 7 senses, in fact, not just 5, but the duration of it is, if not important to us, it goes immediately into loss as if we never even registered it. Now, this is a little bit of an old PowerPoint. As you can see, it comes from a lecture. I just pulled it up from a lecture of 2012. Example of a sequence, right? Instead of reading multiple pages on, who was president when, put them in a sequence. Similarly, you can, historical events, right? Instead of highlighting and outlining multiple pages as you're reading about historical events, create a sequence. So I remember at that time, we were quite not sure what was going to happen with this selection, but obviously by now, all of us know. Example of a diagram, right? This is, in fact, I think my own drawing. As you're reading about, biology, anatomy, physiology, think about physiology books, anatomy books. They all include incredibly detailed diagrams because we know that they're critical for the learning. You can't present information about anatomy, physiology by narrative alone. And so there may be instances where, probably not in an anatomy or a physiology textbook, but in some other textbooks where a diagram is really helpful. The textbook might not provide it for you, but it might be really helpful for you to kind of create your own diagram, again, to reinforce. This is not because you're a visual learner. The book also talks about learning styles and the myths related to it. But this is because some information is just very appropriate to be presented in a visual manner. And so that's the bottom line for visually mapping. Many of you know how to do Venn diagrams, right? So 2 bodies of information with the sort of the overlapping area to identify commonalities. All right. Do we have other questions, Eleanor? I'm not quite sure what I will present on the screen, but I'll just keep this up. Okay.
We've had a couple of people ask if this will be available later. Yes, it will. We're recording right now. And then we have one last question from Carmen Varela. Carmen says, great presentation, thank you. I'm definitely thinking of how this might benefit me, but also my students who are people with disabilities and who are often challenged with self-regulation, attention and focus. Are there parts of the textbook that you believe could be extrapolated and used when working with students directly that would help them better understand their learning?
Hi, Carmen, first of all. So the book, definitely that's one of the sort of self-admitted limitations of the book, is that it is written for what we call typical learner, rather than a person with a disability, special need, whether it is visual, auditory, etc. So several of the strategies work because in terms of working memory and cognitive capacity and cognitive processing, things are similar. But admittedly, if you have visual special needs, then, perhaps using representations might be sort of less appropriate. So I think that, a lot of the book applies to all students, and some of it might need to be sort of considered when you have particularly, again, specific sensory needs. So, But I look forward to connecting with you about it later, because self-regulation is self-regulation. The goal is still the same: application of effort, discipline, goal orientation, understanding your motivation, understanding what brings you efficacy, what brings you confidence, why you value certain things, how to create value for tasks that are not inherently valuable for you, you may not have intrinsic value for, which is the case whether you are in college or whether you're at work. I don't enjoy all aspects of my work. I have to get them done. I might not as well fight them. So I will have to locate and create value for some of them. So I think that in the big picture, all of that, all of those self-regulation fundamentals apply to all students, typical as well as the one who may have some special needs. And it is really the sort of the visual and auditory processing, that may need some specific considerations. But thank you for your question.
Carmen says, thank you very much for your answer. We have another question from Helena Severina, who has asked if you could repeat the name of the book.
Okay, so let's see, where is the old PowerPoint? So the book, I can show it. Why don't I do that? I'll show the book. Okay, here it comes. Okay. I don't see my own self on the camera right now. There it is. Okay. Okay. Motivation and learning strategies for college success. A focus on self-regulated learning. So this is the Seli Dembo 6th edition, which was published last fall.
Thanks, Helena. We just have a couple more questions.
Okay.
From Erica. The first is, do you feel students now have a harder time processing information than students in years past?
I think the major change is definitely that distractions are just this thing away. There's constant availability of distractions, not only the ones we choose, but the ones that, sort of we haven't turned notifications off. Facebook, Instagram, emails, texts. So I do find that as of late, folks have this more of an illusion that they are able to multitask, because that's what we're born and raised with, constant split attention. And we know that multitasking is not possible if both tasks require cognitive attention, not just kinesthetic attention, walking, driving, whatnot, but cognitive attention. We cannot do it. It's not multitasking, it's task switching. And the same project that might take you otherwise half an hour to do to a suitable result will now take you 45 minutes to an hour, or if you do it for half an hour, you will have less than a suitable outcome. So I do think the illusion of sort of digital natives being effective multitaskers is a very dangerous one, and I battle this myself with my kids. So yeah, I do believe there are differences, not in terms of how the brain has changed, that hasn't changed at all, but it's the perception that I'm able to multitask effectively that is very dangerous for performance outcomes.
And then we have another question from Erica. Is it possible to have a combination of learners based off different times in one's life?
Could you say that again, Eleanor? You cut up a little bit.
Oh, sorry about that. Is it possible to have a combination of learners based off different times in one's life?
Right, and I think you're referring here to failure acceptors, failure avoiders, etc. it is entirely possible that you have one profile in one course based on your level of confidence or self-efficacy and another profile in another course. However, we do find that those neural networks related to failure avoidance or success orientation do tend to sort of manifest in multiple areas of your life. So it can be the case that you have less failure avoidance in some areas, that you're more confident, that you have had some successful experiences in, and in some areas that you don't know as much about, that sort of embedded neural network of failure avoidance will have a much bigger impact. So yes, so there's definitely variations in which motivation emerged stronger in which context, but there's also some sort of underlying similarities if you really step back and look at it. Excellent question.
A couple more people have asked if you could just repeat the book title one last time.
Okay. It is Motivation and Learning Strategies for College Success, a Focus on Self-Regulated Learning by moi, yours truly, Helena Seli, and Myron H. Dembo, who is my dissertation advisor, my mentor, and my dear friend. So he started the book in the first and second edition, and I think I popped in as an author, co-author in the third and fourth and fifth. And now our order of names, due to Myron's willingness and his kind of stepping back from active academic life, has changed to Seli and Dembo. But I definitely want to give a shout out to Dr. Myron Dembo, who was the original author of this book.
So we have one last question. I'm afraid I think that's all we'll have time for, though if you do type a question that we don't get to answer during this session, we will make sure that we save those all down and answer them in a follow-up. So the last question is from Chrissy again. My students don't take notes anymore. They rely on PowerPoint. How do we work with this?
They need to take notes. You can take notes in PowerPoint. The book, in fact, presents how would you, take a PowerPoint, whether it is printed out in sort of 2-3 slides per page, or note making. And the book also presents the benefits of taking notes via pen and paper rather than taking notes on a laptop or tablet or whatnot. We find that students who take notes on a laptop pretty much become court reporters, right? They take down everything. They're very fast, et cetera, but they don't discriminately listen. They just hear the information and they take verbatim notes, right? While pen and paper, you are first slower. You have to process information more meaningfully. You have to grasp the main ideas with the supporting details rather than, as a court reporter, record everything you're hearing. So the book, in fact, literally presents 2 studies that have been conducted about this very prevalent issue of should college students these days, or students in K-12, take notes by laptop or by pen and paper. We obviously talk also about the digital pen, where notes, become, digitized and better organized, et cetera, et cetera. But the active process of note making, not just taking notes, but making notes, is critical for encoding information. They have to be, so again, if you're only relying on PowerPoints that are given to you, the key in the textbook is moving from passive learners to being active learners. And you cannot be an active learner unless you take notes. So engage in note-taking as well as ultimately note-making, which is the meaningful learning strategy.
Thank you so much, Helena. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I just want to thank everyone who attended today, and thank you, Helena, for being such a fabulous presenter.
All right, thank you. It's a pleasure, and thank you everybody for taking time to be here. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.